activities that I do merely serve to put a somewhat legitimate framework around a very serious case of plant lust. So it is my pleasure to be here with you today and talking about plants, because as I was mentioning to somebody out in the yard a few minutes ago, you know, I know people don't feel like shopping for plants in this cloudy weather, but this is the perfect time to plant. You get these new perennials in the ground when it's cloudy out, and it gives them time to adjust, right, before they have to deal with the dead-on sun. And so plants love it when you plant in this weather, and this is a great time to do it. We may be a little early for the tomatoes, but we can plant perennials. I want to start out this morning by telling you about the time that my cousin ordered trees from the Conservation Commission. See, it turns out that he saw an ad in the paper that said, conservation trees, 12 6-foot trees for $5. This is a good deal, right? 12 6-foot trees for $5. Well, you know how inches is abbreviated with 2 little apostrophes and feet is abbreviated with 1? Well, in the paper that day, what should have been 2 was 1, giving him every thought that he was going to get 12 6-foot trees for $5. So he called up the Conservation Department and he said, I want to reserve 12 trees. And they said, great, give us your name, and you come down in 2 weeks on Saturday and pick them up. So he gives his name and he starts to think as the first week goes by, gee, 6-foot trees, those trees are going to need a big hole, right? What's the saying? You dig a $5 hole for a 50-cent tree, right? And he's thinking, 6-foot trees, that's a big root ball. I need some big holes. So he tells his kids that the next Saturday he needs 12 holes this wide and this deep. Now the kids are not happy about this, right? But Dad says that before they do anything else with their Saturday, they need to dig these holes. So they do. The next week starts going by and my cousin starts to think, gee, 6-foot trees, big root balls. I can't fit these in the station wagon. I have to rent a truck. So he calls up U-Haul, he rents a truck, and while he's at it, he rents a hand cart too, because he's not going to be able to lift those root balls up into the truck. So the appointed Saturday comes, he drives to U-Haul, he picks up his truck, he picks up his hand cart, he drives down to the Conservation Commission, and he notices when he gets there that he doesn't see any trees outside, but he thinks maybe they have them stored somewhere else. He walks into the office and says, I reserved 12 trees. I'm here for my trees. And the man behind the counter leans down and takes out a Ziploc bag with his 12 6-inch trees. And he tells me that to this day his children have not forgiven him for making them dig those holes. I like this story, first of all, because he was willing to tell it on himself, right? And I think there isn't a single human being who hasn't at some point or another run away with our expectations, right? And nowhere do we bring more expectations to the garden than when it comes to perennial plants. I can't tell you the number of times people say to me, I'm tired of planting annuals every year. I want something that's less work, so, you know, where are the perennials? And what perennials should I use? And I always explain to those people that sometimes perennials can be low maintenance, sometimes they can be less work, but sometimes a perennial garden can be the most high maintenance garden you can plant. And it all depends upon the plants that you choose. And so we can't come to our perennial gardens with expectations that they're all going to be the same, that they're all going to come back, and that they're all going to be less work. Because some of them are actually more work than less. Now, the plants that are more work, I call, those are the plants that are pass along plants. Those are the plants that you see in the plant sales, right? The spring plant sales that are going on, every organization has one to raise money at this time of year. And those plant sales are filled with things like Siberian iris and monarda and Shasta daisies and nice plants, but these are plants that are more work. Stephanie Foster, who writes for the Cape Cod Times, the garden column for the Cape Cod Times, she once said to me, she said, I have a rule, never accept a plant someone else wants to give you. There's a reason they happen to give away, right? There's a reason that those Siberian iris end up in the plant sales, and it's because they need frequent dividing, or a plant that needs frequent editing, they end up in plant sales. So if you want your perennial garden to be less work, don't buy those plants. Look for the plants that don't end up in the plant sales, and there are dozens and dozens of them. So, and I have some plants here to talk about today, and I'm going to talk about perennial maintenance and how you can make your perennial garden less work. And we're going to talk about the need to do, the nice to do, and the nuts to do. Or the maybe not so necessary to do as long as you pick the right plants. And that's what it's all about in the perennial garden. The plants that are more work, I call, those are the plants that are pass-along plants. Those are the plants that you see in the plant sales, right? The spring plant sales that are going on, every organization has one to raise money at this time of year. And those plant sales are filled with things like Siberian iris and monarda and Shasta daisies and nice plants, but these are plants that are more work. Stephanie Foster, who writes for the Cape Cod Times, the garden column for the Cape Cod Times, she once said to me, she said, I have a rule, never accept a plant someone else wants to give you. There's a reason they happen to give away, right? There's a reason that those Siberian iris end up in the plant sales, and it's because they need frequent dividing, or a plant that needs frequent editing, they end up in plant sales. So if you want your perennial garden to be less work, don't buy those plants. Look for the plants that don't end up in the plant sales, and there are dozens and dozens of them. So, and I have some plants here to talk about today, and I'm going to talk about perennial maintenance and how you can make your perennial garden less work. And we're going to talk about the need to do, the nice to do, and the nuts to do. Or the maybe not so necessary to do as long as you pick the right plants. And that's what it's all about in the perennial garden. I often compare gardening with perennials to being a third grade teacher. You know, a third grade teacher has, 25 kids in the classroom these days. And each of those children has a different learning style and needs to be approached in a slightly different way. And that third grade teacher has to reach every one of those kids and teach them how to spell and to write and to read and all the things that you learn in elementary school. And at the same time, they have to keep order in the classroom. Well, working with perennials is very similar because each one of those plants has different needs, right? And maybe you want to group them according to their needs, and that makes it a little bit easier. But you have to do that while still keeping order in the garden. All right, so let's start out by talking about the need to do in a perennial garden. And the absolute number one need to do in a perennial garden is weeding. Weeding is number one because weeds will grow on the edges of your perennial plants. Weeds will grow in the center of your perennial plant. Those Siberian iris, right? They go out like this, and all that new growth goes out, and it abandons the territory in the middle. And that's how you know when a Siberian iris needs to be divided, is when it starts to get that sort of donut look, and it gets empty in the middle. Well, that empty area in the middle of that Siberian iris clump is valuable real estate for weeds, right? The weeds are going to move in there. And so you need to be on the lookout, and this is a perfect time of year to be on the lookout for what perennial weeds have invaded your garden. And at this time of year, our gardens are filled with chickweed and The little bitter cress and the winter cress, those are all fall germinating weeds. The seeds germinated last September. They grew all winter under the snow. And now is the time that we need to pull them out of the garden because they're going to seed very quickly again. You could weed in your perennial garden practically every month of the year. You really could. And I am a big fan of what I call cup of coffee, glass of wine weeding. And the whole theory is this, is that if you feel like you have to get your entire perennial garden weeded all at once, you're probably not going to do it, right? Because it's just too overwhelming. But if you go out in the garden with your favorite beverage, you know, be it in the morning or afternoon or early evening, and you just spend 20 minutes, half an hour, pulling weeds, sipping your beverage, right? You use that beverage as your reward for being out there. And then once the beverage is gone and you've done it for 15, 20 minutes, you stop and you go back in the house. And you don't think of it as being this overwhelming task that you have to do all at once, because it is actually amazing how many weeds that you can pull in 15 or 20 minutes. It really is. So I would approach your perennial gardens that way. Another need to do is to edit out those perennials that might be more enthusiastic about growing or self-seeding. Just because that perennial has taken up more space in your garden does not mean you have to leave it there. And just because you're pulling a lot of that bee balm or those black-eyed Susans or whatever it is out, doesn't mean that you have to plant them someplace else. It's okay to throw a plant away. It really is. It's okay to say, thank you for coming, but you're out of here, okay? And we need to do that in a perennial garden because otherwise our gardens will be all Monarda or all black-eyed Susans, right? And nothing else. And so editing is an absolute need to do in the perennial garden. The nice to do in the perennial garden is to water during a drought. And the number one thing that I think every perennial gardener should have is a rain gauge. Rain gauges are very important for a perennial gardener because weather like this fools us, right? Now I looked out of my rain gauge yesterday, and out of this system in the past 2 or 3 days, we've gotten just about an inch of rain. That's important information for me. That tells me that for the next week or even 2 weeks, if the weather is cool like this, I don't have to water anything. Because what your gardens and what your lawns need is an inch of rain a week. That's what we need. But sometimes in weather like this where you get little downpours or drizzle periodically, it seems like we've gotten a lot of rain, especially when it goes on and on and on like it is of late. But you might look at your rain gauge and see that we've only gotten, a half of an inch or a quarter of an inch of rain. And so this really provides you with good information, and there are many styles of rain gauges. There are big ones that you can see from the house, you don't even have to go outside to look at, and small ones that are not obtrusive in the garden, so you can pick the rain gauge that suits you and your style of garden best as well. If we go into the summer and we have a week or 10 days without a nice rainfall, then you might want to water. And the best way to water perennials is to provide that equivalent of an inch of rain in one period. The worst way to water perennials is to have an automatic system that comes on for 15, 20 minutes every other day or every 3 days. That's a prescription for leaf spot fungus. It creates shallow-rooted perennials that are more likely to die in the wintertime. It creates crown rot on some plants, and so you lose them in the summer even though you are watering. So you want a deep soaking less often. Another nice thing to do in a perennial garden is mulching, because that helps preserve the water. It helps get rid of those weeds or prevent those weeds from growing, which is always great. And it also adds organic matter to the soil. And so a couple inches of bark mulch, whatever variety you like the look of, whether it's the dyed orange, dyed black, or natural pine bark mulch, doesn't matter. That's a personal choice. But about 2 inches put down at this time of year can save you a lot of weeding, it can save you a lot of watering, and it looks nice in the perennial garden too, and it adds organic matter from the top down. And that is of huge importance in a perennial garden. Probably more important than fertilizing, although if you have sandy soil, a once-a-year application of an organic fertilizer like flower tone or plant tone is always a good idea. For sandy soil, it's more important than it is if you have clay or if you have a really good garden. Another thing that you can use in a perennial garden that we've just seen introduced onto the market is people are finally realizing that soil in a garden is a living community. And the microorganisms that are there help our plants to grow. And if you have a perennial garden in very sandy soil, or if you have perennials that maybe aren't doing so well, or a perennial that was really hit in the past winter and it looks like it could use a boost, maybe used to be a nice thick clump of coral bells and now you've got just 2 or 3 sprigs that you see life there, but the plant isn't vigorous. One of these Thrive products, either New Plant Thrive or Flower Thrive, these are all contain the bacteria and the natural microorganisms that help plants to grow. And so this can even be more useful than fertilizer frequently, or combined with an organic fertilizer. For a plant that's not doing well, it can give it that sort of double boost, which can be very important for perennials. An application of compost or composted manure over a perennial garden at least every other year, and every year if you can do it is a wonderful thing and a very good, nice to do. And all you need is about 1 inch of compost or composted manure. And the rhythm that I get on is at this time of year, I put down my bark mulch, and then in the fall, in October or November, right over whatever's left of that bark mulch, I put down 1 inch of composted manure. The following spring, I see what's not doing so well, and I might use the Thrive product. And on the rest of the garden, I put down 1 application of an organic or highly organic fertilizer like the flower tone. And that's all the fertilizing I do in my perennial garden. What you need to remember for perennials is that keeping them on a leaner diet and using an organic fertilizer actually makes them stronger, okay? People sometimes think about fertilizer as being something that makes plants stronger, but synthetic fertilizers do not. And you want to reserve your synthetic fertilizers for your annuals. They can use fast food. So you reserve those for your annual plants that have a short season to grow and do their thing. The perennials, you want to have a once-a-year application of an organic or highly organic fertilizer, and then when you have a plant that's in trouble, using the soil biology that is intended for that plant.